Broadcasting live today from the offices of the Nation magazine in New York City, and I'm so pleased to have sitting right next to me Katrina vanden Heuvel, the publisher of the Nation.
It's thrilling to. I'm so pleased you're here.
Set
up here to do your terrific radio show.
I'm so pleased you let us use your conference room, and it's what a cool place you've got.
You have behind you. I don't know if you're. I don't know if people can see it. They will at some point, but you have the cover of the very first issue of the Nation. July 6, 1865.
Wow.
We're the oldest weekly. And the first line, Tom, is one we will not reprise today, but the week was singularly barren of exciting events. Can you imagine launching a magazine with that buzzy statement?
In 1865.
In 1865, when in fact there were, coming out of the Civil War and into Reconstruction.
And Andrew Johnson.
There was some serious, I don't know, exciting, but there was tumult as there is today in our republic. Yeah,
well, let's talk about our republic. I mean, you're at the nerve center here. I look around the offices, and you've got all these people sitting at computers working, and you've got reporters out in the field, and we're going to have a couple of your regular columnists on the program today. What is yours? The three big stories I think right now are Whitaker, and it turns out that it's looking more and more like he's kind of a right-wing crazy. I mean, he's one of these Breitbart guys. And the possibility of shutting down the Mueller investigation, the midterms that we just had. And I didn't hear it, but I noticed that on one of the websites I read this morning that his rant this morning was particularly deranged. Apparently, he was quoting like almost verbatim from Breitbart. So
I think we're in for a very dangerous time because as Trump feels boxed in by the midterm outcome. I mean, taking back one house, the House offers some constraint on his unfettered power. He will do what he said, go into a warlike mode, and I think that's very dangerous, and I think it requires all of people, who, not left or right, but citizens of this country, to be even more engaged. I mean, we saw in the midterms, what excited me was the level of engagement, the turnout, the passion, the strategy, what we saw in wins, which don't get enough coverage, it seems to me, in the mainstream press. But we took back the House, but we also governorships, state houses. After years of losing, we took there were all kinds of seats that people don't even think about, and young people were vying for them. And Run for Something had 682 candidates and won 300 seats. So there's an engagement, but when you come out of an election, you know this, Tom, you can't demobilize because voting is the first step on the road to participation. We have recounts going on in some key races, Stacey Abrams in Florida with Andrew Gillum and Nelson, and I think people need to stay focused on that because, again, our system is in such need of radical reform. Yeah. I mean, that voting in this country is still the scandal it is. I mean, the actual infrastructure of voting. Yeah. You've studied this.
I don't think this is an accident.
I don't think it's an accident. I think, in fact, I would say after 2000 and the coup that took place, Bush against Gore, that we didn't have an investment in our voting infrastructure, which sounds so unsexy, was a very strategic decision on the part of those who don't want to see more people vote. Yeah. And the voter suppression is targeted, it's well funded. So I have to say, I wake up in the morning with despair and I wake up with fighting spirit. And I wake up with a sense that this country is engaged in ways it hasn't been in a long time. And that the ideas that you've been talking about on your show or we've been writing about in the Nation are suddenly no longer considered fringe or marginal, but are at the center of the debate. So I think that there's, you think of Medicare for all, free higher public ed, 15 minimum wage, jobs guarantee. These are ideas now in play and important.
And these are things that when Bernie
Sanders,
let's give Bernie credit for this. He brought all of these things to national prominence, and he was explicitly, repeatedly, particularly on national television media. Yeah,
I was talking to someone this morning. We were talking about climate crisis, which is also at the center of the debate in important ways. One of the first presidential debates, CBS's John Dickerson asked the candidates, Bernie, Hillary, I think O'Malley was still in, what's the major national security crisis? Bernie said climate crisis, global warming. John Dickerson laughed laughed.
Wow.
I mean, and I think that that may happen, but we're in a different. I think Bernie Sanders moved the dial, but not just Bernie Sanders. The millions of people who supported him, and those who had built these ideas from the bottom up. And Bernie had them in his DNA, and what he did was speak to thousands of people at rallies around this country and in the media, and refuse to be delegitimized.
Yeah.
And it led people around this country, think of, I mean, not so much you or me, but people who came to rallies in towns where maybe they were considered a little marginal, and they heard a presidential candidate speak the way he did. It was a lifeline. It was a sense, I'm not crazy. These are mainstream ideas in many ways. But I think that it's going to take a bold, inclusive, multiracial solidarity populism to begin to blunt, and tackle the ethno-reactionary right-wing populism, which Trump is mastering and driving and hijacking the Republican Party with. It's much more complicated than a traditional Republican president.
I think it absolutely is. But by the way, to our listeners, I see we have calls right now on the board from Illinois, Ohio, North Carolina, California, and New Mexico. Katrina's with us for the half hour, so I'll be picking up your calls at the bottom of the hour. You're welcome to hang on if you want, but just FYI because typically on Friday I
you get a lot.
Calls.
You get calls.
We call it Anything Goes Friday. I don't typically have guests, and so people are.
I like that participatory radio
Yeah,
spirit. That's good.
I love it, and it's my favorite part of the show. Actually, is talking to the people who are interacting and listening to the program. My show yesterday, I opened it with the question: is Trump our first Confederate president? And I didn't mean that glibly. The values of the Confederacy, white male supremacy. Patriarchy,
racist nationalism,
white nationalism, a system of labor that at that time, it was brutal enslavement,
indentured, but indentured kind of.
But that survives in our prison system, which is increasingly becoming a profit center and privatized. And in many ways, it survives not in a way that you would call slavery, but in a way that you could call wage slavery or something.
Absolutely.
I don't want to minimize slavery, because it's like Holocaust, But in the minute until we hit the break here, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I come back again. I mean, I think what we're witnessing, you picking up on the Confederate presidency, is a revival of a harder-edged, white supremacist Southern strategy.
Yeah.
And for your listeners, Southern strategy was driving the wedge issues to really drive race and racism into a politics. Nixon, Buchanan, Kevin Phillips. And I think to counter that Southern strategy demands, again, a kind of multiracial building of a coalition that speaks to very different values. But there's no question that Trump, and it's not just Trump, Tom, you know this, it's the forces of Trumpism that are part of this resurgence of a 21st century Confederacy. Though I wouldn't simply root it in that experience, because what's striking is as you look around globally, there's a resurgence of this ethno-reactionary populism. The Confederate experience very seared into the American experience, but there is a global phenomenon that we're witnessing, so one has to look deeply.
I think, Orban, Erdogan, Duterte.
We need to look at the sources. We need to look at the roots. How do we address it? How do we address it? There's a reason that there's an ascendancy of strong men in these times.
Yeah, and I want to continue that conversation. I think it's a really important one. Katrina vanden Heuvel is with us.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
And we're broadcasting live from the offices of the Nation magazine. We'll be back in just a minute. Welcome back. We're broadcasting live from the offices of the Nation magazine. Katrina vanden Heuvel, the publisher of the Nation, is here with us. The magazine that started in 1865 and is still ticking.
Let me step back for a moment, though, because we've been talking about left-wing internationalism. But I want to bring it home to the insurgency we're seeing in this country. And it comes off of Democratic Socialists for America and the growth they've seen. But I think, a lot of the media after this midterm, progressives, they didn't do that well, and let's write them off. I think that's wrong. I think we're seeing the beginnings of a powerful insurgency of new candidates, new voices, new independent electoral power structures, small donors who are sick of the big donors rigging the rules of the game. And, there are these, it's not just DSA. I mean, you have the kind of older groups, Working Families Party, People's Action, you have Indivisible, you have Democracy for America. You have extraordinary groups on the ground, like Georgia Organizing Project, Lancaster Stands Up. I mean, I think the building out of this not sexy term infrastructure will redefine our politics in important ways. I'm excited by the left, diverse, passionate women who are going to be more than 100 women and a younger generation. Your listeners know about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, but also Ayanna Pressley, Deb Haaland, Jahana Hayes, and Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar. I mean, they will come, by the way, and bring a new dimension to the idea of war and peace, because they're interested in the world, to come back to that. I mean, AOC, as we call her here, she did her interview for the DSA endorsement at this table.
Wow.
We lent them the offices. I mean, we're independent, but she was here.
Yeah.
But she has a peace plank in her platform, and understands that endless war and this crazy defense budget rob resources needed to rebuild our own country. Rashida Tlaib, Palestinian, Ilhan Omar, Somali, two Muslim women. They are engaged in the world, as is Ro Khanna, who you have on your program.
Yeah, he's every other week.
His grandfather marched with Gandhi, was in prison with Gandhi. I think he comes out...
I didn't know that.
Yeah, he comes... I mean, what interests me about Ro is that I really think there's an anti-colonial history there that informs his interest in restraint and anti-intervention and building an alternative kind of
I'm going to have
engagement
to have,
with the world.
He comes on every other week and takes calls for
his
a full hour.
grandfather, yeah.
And that's, I had no idea.
So he's an interesting... So I take some heart in the beginnings of an insurgency, and I resist very mightily post-mortems that it's not happening. And then there are my colleague John Nichols, whom you know.
And is going to be on the show today.
I mean, I love the fact that we took back the governorships, more than the governorships, but certainly of the states which arguably gave Trump the election: Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania.
And yet we're seeing the way that Erdogan and the way that Orban and David Leonhardt did a great piece on this the other day in the New York Times, seized power was first they stacked the courts.
Yeah.
So that when they began behaving in ways that were unconstitutional, the courts just turned the other cheek. And Mitch McConnell's aggressively doing that. I see Brett Kavanaugh as part of that. And it concerns me tremendously that the courts, the last resort that we have historically turned to, particularly with judicial review and judicial supremacy, are
increasingly in the hands of a theocratic right. No, I think you're right. The Senate, which we haven't talked about, is also an anti-democratic institution, the way it's constituted. I think that the progressive left needs to do some radical thinking and putting on offer radical thoughts, and I mean going to the root. Behind you on the wall is from 1937. The nation was divided, but half the nation supported Franklin Roosevelt's court reform program, as I call it. Another half opposed his court packing. I think the left needs to do some tough thinking about putting out there new ideas for reform of the courts, maybe term limits.
I have a book coming out on that next fall.
And the Senate needs to be thought, I mean, how it was originally constituted is anti-democratic. But I think there are a set of rules that govern our system. Simple ones like ensuring easy access to voting, the right to vote. What we saw in Florida, Amendment 4 was exciting.
Yeah.
The Florida Voting Restoration Act giving 1.4 Floridians the right to vote. But as John and I have talked about, Nichols, people incarcerated should have the right to vote. There should be a set of democracy reforms that are not my eyes glaze over, but are linked to movements in motion, which care and understand what these mean for their constituents, for people, for their issues. But the courts are, I mean, with Ruth Bader Ginsburg yesterday, breaking her ribs, I mean, it's
frightening.
And the Kavanaugh, that went down in such raw, you're so right, Mitch McConnell, it's raw, brutal power to achieve objectives. And we saw that with the Merrick Garland way that was handled. Yeah. So we need to do some tough thinking and
we do
some radical reform.
We have just a little more than a minute left.
Okay.
What's in the Nation right now, the Nation magazine?
Well, we went to press just the day of the election, so we have 3 very smart analyses about the midterms. But the cover story is by the woman who won the Nobel Peace Prize a year ago, Beatrice Finn, who's chair of the International Committee to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. And there's her remarkable remarks, part of the Jonathan Schell lecture series, and as well a conversation she did with Eric Schlosser, who's written a terrific book on command and control and nuclear weapons. It reminds us of the peril of nuclear weapons, but it also reminds us of the possibility that we find a way to bring together the energy of the climate movement with a new nuclear movement, because the peril is very great, Tom, and I think it is, as she writes, it's a feminist issue too. So it's about a feminist foreign policy and nuclear weapons. So that's the cover. Unusual at this time, but we closed the morning post-midterm.
That's remarkable. I mean,
but she's a force, and I care deeply about reviving an anti-nuke movement, and I do think combining it with the energy of climate crisis movement, the climate movement, which Bill McKibben and others have built up, would be a way to go.
Yeah. There's in fact, we've got a new movie that we're debuting in Norway, the Norwegian Parliament. There's a conference January 5th in Oslo, and I'll be there. And they're broadcasting our movie. HBO funded it, and Leo's producing it. And on the inside of the dome, we're going to see the movie. But,
that's exciting.
There's stuff happening.
There's stuff happening.
Katrina,
thank you very
so much.
Thank you. I'm so happy you're here.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
We'll be back with your calls right after this break. Stick around. Katrina vanden Heuvel, thank you so much.
You.
And thanks to the Nation magazine for letting us use their studio.